We're now going to take a closer look at the brain, the spinal cord, and the nerves, and take a look at their structure and their functions. So let's start by giving the location and function of the four main divisions of the brain. And so here's an image of the brain. It's a little bit translucent so that we can see the inside purple region there that we'll take a look at the name and function in a moment. But we'll start off with the cerebrum. This is the largest part of the brain and the upper portion of the brain. It's related to higher level thinking, and we'll take a closer look at this portion actually in a moment when we look at the divisions or the subdivisions of it. For now, let's move on to the diencephalon. And so the diencephalon is located beneath the cerebrum and above the brainstem, which is the next region that we'll look at. It has two major regions, the thalamus and the hypothalamus. The thalamus serves as a relay station where information coming into the brain from up the brainstem will then get to the thalamus, and then the thalamus will send it to the appropriate region of the cerebrum. And again, we'll look at those regions in a moment to note that they control different aspects of the body. The hypothalamus is an area that we'll take a look at again in just a moment when we further dive into the diencephalon. The brainstem connects the spinal cord with the higher brain structures. It's composed of the midbrain, the pons, and the medulla oblongata, which we'll look at in a moment here. It again serves as a relay station for sensory information coming up from the spinal cord to the higher brain, as well as motor information coming down from the cerebrum down to the spinal cord. Finally, we have the cerebellum. And this is a structure that is sort of at the back of the brain that's under the posterior most portion of the cerebrum. It plays a role in coordination of movements. So information sent from the cerebrum about moving around, if I were to, let's say, walk across a room, I would be sending information down from my cerebrum, down through my brainstem, down my spinal cord. But first, it would actually go into my cerebellum to be coordinated so that my movements would not be jerky movements where I'm sort of not coordinated moving my muscles so that I smoothly move across the room. But the cerebellum helps coordinate all of that. And so my cerebrum decides which muscles to move and that I consciously want to walk across the room. But the cerebellum helps to make those movements nice and fluid. So let's start by focusing in on the cerebrum and the four areas that I mentioned earlier that are the subdivisions of it. Before we get into those subdivisions though, it's important to note a couple of things about the brain. So what we can see here is that there are all these bumps and grooves on the outside portion of the brain. And so the bumps are actually called gyri, and the grooves are called sulci. And so we can see a couple of the sulci labeled here, the central sulcus and the lateral sulcus, and those are labeled here to indicate divisions between the various regions of the brain. Another thing that we should note is that the cerebrum has dark matter, gray matter on the outside, and then we have white matter on the inside. And so we don't have a cross-section image here, but if we were to cross-section through the brain, we would actually see that the outside region, called the cortex, is actually made up of darker material than the inside portion of the brain. And so that outer portion, the cortex, is made up of gray matter because this is where we find a lot of cell bodies of the neurons that make up the brain. The white matter is white because this is where we find the axons and the myelinated portion of the axons inside the brain. And this is because the outside of the brain, the cortex, with all that gray matter made up of many cell bodies, is where all the processing of information occurs. That's related here to the sulci and the bumps and grooves and so on, because we have all these gyri and sulci because it increases the surface area and therefore the amount of gray matter that we can actually have in our brain. And so our brains have a larger amount of processing that can occur because we're able to have more gray matter. Focusing then again on the cerebrum, we have the central sulcus and lateral sulcus, and as I mentioned, they divide these regions of the cerebrum. And so let's look at the first, which is the frontal lobe. The frontal lobe is the motor area. It also plays a role in personality, behavior, emotion expression, and then intelligent functions. The second is the temporal lobe. It plays a role in hearing and smell, taste, and memory storage. We have the occipital lobe at the posterior region of the brain. The occipital lobe plays a role in vision and vision-related reflexes and functions, like reading, judging distances, and seeing in 3 dimensions. And then finally, we have the parietal lobe. This is the somatosensory area because it is getting sensory information from the body, particularly from the skin, muscles, and then senses related to taste, speech, and reading. We could take a closer look at smaller regions within these regions, and we don't need to memorize these areas, but just to say it's not as easy a division as in front of the central sulcus this is processed, and behind the central sulcus this is processed. But we have these regions like the primary motor area that is running right along the central sulcus, but is at the rear portion of the frontal lobe. We have the motor speech area, Broca's area, that, yes, plays a role in motor speech, so moving the muscles of our tongue and mouth, and it is in the frontal lobe, but running right along the temporal lobe because there are areas between those two lobes that are connected in order for motor speech to function properly. And so I'll reveal some of the other areas then that are found within the brain. And we've already mentioned some of these in going over the main regions, the frontal, parietal, temporal, and occipital lobes of the cerebrum. Okay, so let's move on to the diencephalon and explain the functions of the hypothalamus and the medulla oblongata. So let's start with a cross-section of the brain. So now we're actually looking at just one half of the brain, and so we're better able to see the inside. And so the diencephalon, as we mentioned earlier, are made up of the thalamus and then the hypothalamus. Another portion that is actually connected to the hypothalamus and intimately related is the pituitary gland. And we will take a closer look at this when we get to the endocrine system in just a couple of units. We also have then the brainstem, which is made up of the midbrain, the pons, and the medulla. As we mentioned in the learning outcome here, we want to take a look at what the hypothalamus does and the medulla oblongata do. The hypothalamus is an important connection point between the nervous system and the endocrine or hormone system. It is key for integrating autonomic nervous signals, helping to regulate things like temperature, water balance, thirst, appetite, and then some emotions. And it helps to control the endocrine system through hormones it releases to trigger the pituitary gland to then do its function. The medulla oblongata's vital function then is in the regulation of heart rate, blood flow, blood pressure, and then respiratory centers. So it plays a role in controlling how quickly our heart is beating, or how quickly we're breathing, or the size of our blood vessels in order to help regulate our blood pressure. We've already mentioned the role of the cerebellum in controlling movements and controlling posture. And so now let's move on to describe the structure and function of the spinal cord. So if we were to take a cross-section of the spinal cord, we would see what you see here. And so let's label and point out a couple things of the spinal cord. First is, different from the brain, we actually have the gray matter of the spinal cord. So the cell bodies of the neurons inside the spinal cord, in the middle of the spinal cord, and we have white matter on the outside. So the axons, the myelinated axons, actually come out of the gray matter and run up and down the spinal cord in the white matter, but that's on the outside of the gray matter, which is the opposite of what you find within the brain. You can see that there's a bit of a butterfly shape to the gray matter in the spinal cord, and so let's label a few of these regions. We have the dorsal horns. And so these are the regions towards the posterior portion of the body. And so dorsal is another term for posterior. And so these are the gray matter extensions that move to the posterior or dorsal portion of the spinal cord. We have this central canal, which will play a role in cerebrospinal fluid that we'll take a look at in a few moments. And then we have the ventral horns, the anterior portion. Ventral, again, being another term for anterior, meaning that these horns are towards the front of the body, the front of the spinal cord. One thing we want to take a look at then are tracts. We mentioned tracts earlier on in this unit. And so if we were to look at axons running up and down within the spinal cord, we would see these tracts where these are regions where the axons in them are actually running along the exact same area, and they're coming from similar areas in the body and going to similar areas in the brain. So for example, we can see the spinothalamic tract. So the little dots there are trying to indicate axons all running up at the white matter region of the spinal cord there. But the spinothalamic, we can break that down to say this is a tract running along the spine that will then go up to the thalamus. And so again, it's a tract because all these axons are running in the same region of the spine, and they're actually going to run up to the thalamus, end up in the same spot. We have the corticospinal tract. So this is an area where we have all these axons from these neurons that are running from the cortex down through the spine. Another thing that we should note, as indicated by the legend down in the bottom of the screen here, is that we have ascending and descending tracts. And so ascending tracts are going up, and they're bringing, therefore, sensory information up the spine, up to the brain. Descending tracts are axons that are going down, and these are motor tracts, motor neurons that are bringing information from the brain down the spine, and then will eventually go out of the spine to the periphery. And so now we can take a look at the spinal cord from the posterior view of the body. And what we want to note here is not so much the spinal cord, but the peripheral nerves that are coming out of the spinal cord. And so the spinal nerves are broken down into these regions here. And so in the cervical region, cervical meaning the neck region, we actually have 8 pairs of spinal nerves. They are labeled C1 through C8 to indicate the 8 nerves, and they come out in pairs, one going out the right side and one going out the left side of the vertebral column. We have the thoracic spinal nerves. There are 12 pairs of them, again labeled T1 through T12. And the nice part about this is we've already looked at the thoracic region of the body being the upper portion of the torso. And so the thoracic nerves are actually the nerves that come out of the spine within that region. The lumbar region of the spinal cord was mentioned earlier on in the course, and so here we have the 5 lumbar nerves that come out in this lumbar region. Below that we have 5 sacral nerves, and then below that we have 1 coccygeal nerve. This image here shows that these nerves serve various portions of the body. As indicated by the green here, the neck and then the shoulders and most regions of the arm are actually served by the cervical nerves. The trunk and then the one region of the arm that indicated in blue are served by the thoracic nerves. The lumbar nerves serve most of the area of our legs, and then the sacral nerves serving the inguinal region and then the lateral portion of our lower leg. We've taken a look now at the brain and the spine. As you know, and as you have learned here now as well, these are very important regions in terms of our overall body function. Therefore, these are important regions to protect, and we're going to look at what are called the meninges and name and describe the 3 meninges, which ultimately are protective layers for the brain and the spinal cord. If we were to cross-section through this region of the brain here and zoom in, this is what we would see. You can see the skin and the bone of the skull that ultimately serve as protection for the brain, just like we have the vertebral bones that provide protection to the spinal cord. But we also have the meninges. And these are different layers that we want to look at now that provide protection and cushioning for the brain within the skull. The first meninge is the dura mater. The dura mater, what that Latin translates to is the hard substance. And so this is the outermost meninge that's just beneath the bone of the skull. And it's not as hard as the bone, but it is the layer that's right up against that hard skull, and so it itself is a little bit hard. The middle layer of the meninges is the arachnoid mater. And it's called the arachnoid mater because, as you can see, the space just beneath the yellow arachnoid mater here kind of looks like a spider web. And so the arachnoid actually comes from the Latin for spider. And then the third layer is the pia mater. That is the blue layer here just running along the outside of the cerebrum of the brain. And the pia is referring to small or thin. This is a small or thin protective layer just outside of the brain tissue. In between these layers, we have other terms that are important to learn the names of. And so between the dura mater and arachnoid mater, we actually have the subdural space. The nice part about this is if we break down the name, sub means below, and dural is referring to the dura mater. And so the subdural is referring to the space that's below the dura but before the arachnoid mater. Along that same vein, we have the subarachnoid space. And this is that space where we have that spider web looking material, and it is beneath the arachnoid space before the pia mater. Let's take a closer look then at the spinal cord. As we can see here, we have the spinal cord. Wrapping around the spinal cord are the same three layers. If we were to take a cross section through this, we would actually be looking at the image like on the right here, and we'd see that there's the pia mater closest to the spinal cord. We have the arachnoid mater, the middlemost layer, and then we have the dura mater, the outermost layer of the meninges wrapping around the spinal cord. These three meninges ultimately give protection, as we said, to the brain and spine, but they play a role along with cerebrospinal fluid. And so the term cerebrospinal is referring to around the cerebrum, so around the brain, and then spinal around the spine. Ultimately, the cerebrospinal fluid is made in special regions of the brain called the ventricles. As we can see in the image here, we have the lateral ventricles and then the third and fourth ventricles, as well as the cerebral aqueduct, so a little duct that allows for the cerebrospinal fluid to actually get out from those ventricles. The cerebrospinal fluid ultimately is made in the region here, the choroid plexus, and it's made by cells that we looked at earlier in this unit, the ependymal cells. The ependymal cells of the choroid plexus ultimately make the cerebrospinal fluid. It moves into the ventricles and then down through the central canal of the spinal cord and out and around in the subarachnoid space and the dural sinus surrounding the brain. Ultimately, as mentioned, along with the three meningeal layers, the cerebrospinal fluid gives some cushioning to the brain and the spine. You can imagine if you were moving around and all of a sudden you got hit in the head, your brain is going to move around within your skull, potentially bumping up against your skull and getting damaged. And so we have the meningeal layers in order to provide protection, but we have this fluid in there as well, the cerebrospinal fluid, to give some cushioning to allow the brain to not move quite as hard or hit up against the skull quite as hard, therefore limiting the damage. In addition to that, the cerebrospinal fluid moves around the brain and spine, picking up any wastes and returning them ultimately to the venous system, so to the veins of the cardiovascular system, to be ultimately returned to the heart and then brought to the regions of the body that get rid of those wastes. And so ultimately these are the two major functions of the cerebrospinal fluid, to provide some protection to the brain and spine, but then also to pick up wastes and help to move them to the cardiovascular system for disposal. We've been mentioning nerves throughout this unit. We've already talked about them, we've talked about spinal nerves as well, but we haven't taken a close look at the structure of a nerve and comparing the cranial and spinal nerves. So let's start with that. Let's take a look here at an image we saw earlier, a posterior view of the spinal cord with the spinal nerves coming out from it. But forgetting the spinal cord here for a moment, if we were to actually take a look at a nerve, let's say here in the arm, this is what we'd see. This is one overall nerve, and it has this complex structure to it that we want to analyze now. Within this nerve, we actually have blood vessels. These blood vessels are bringing in nutrients and removing waste from the cells that are making up the nerve. And then the nerve itself is made up of many neurons. And so this is one neuron that we're looking at here, and coming out of the end there, beneath the myelin sheath, and then the wrapping that's around the neuron within the nerve, we actually have an axon. And so what we could see here is that a nerve is actually made up of many neurons. And so each one of these little bundles, we only have one sticking out here, but each one of these little bundles within the other bundles are actually neurons. And so a nerve is made up of many neurons that are either running towards the central nervous system, they're sensory neurons, or away from the central nervous system, they're motor neurons, bringing information out to muscle or glands and so on. We've already looked at the spinal nerves as well. And so we have the cervical 8 spinal nerves, we have the thoracic 12 spinal nerves, lumbar 5, sacral 5, and coccygeal nerves just 1. Each of these nerves have the structure of what we just looked at. One other thing to note about the spinal nerves is that the axons within them are actually a mixture of sensory neurons bringing information towards the central nervous system and motor neurons bringing information away from the central nervous system. That's different than the cranial nerves. This is a lot of information here to take in at once, but the cranial nerves come out of the lower portion of the brain and the brainstem. And they tend to provide, for the most part, connection to the upper part of our body. Though you can see here the vagus nerve, number 10, goes down to our internal organs. One thing that we should note about the cranial nerves that differs from the spinal nerves is that these nerves can be mixed, just like the spinal nerves, with motor neurons and sensory neurons running through the same nerve. But some of them can be purely sensory neurons. Some of them can be made up of purely motor neurons. In order to take a closer look at that, let's focus in on the cranial nerves here. Let's take a look at cranial nerve number 1 and cranial nerve number 2. So the olfactory nerve and the optic nerve. These nerves are picking up sensory information from the nose and from the eye respectively about smell and about sight, and then bringing that information into the brain for processing. So these nerves are purely sensory. They're made up 100% of sensory neurons that are bringing in that sensory information to the brain. The oculomotor nerve, nerve number 3 here, is bringing motor information out to the muscles of the eye to allow for the movement of our eye within the socket. And so this nerve is made up 100% of motor neurons because they're only bringing motor information out to the eye to cause that motion. If we take a look at cranial nerve number 7, the facial nerve, this is an example then of a mixed nerve. It's bringing motor information out to the muscles of the face to allow for movement. But it's also gathering sensory information from the face, things like touch and so on, and bringing that information into the brain to provide information about what's going on with our face. And so there are several similarities and differences between cranial and spinal nerves.